Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Black Swan Rising podcast. I am your host, Michael B. Rush. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about timing, where we are in the events of the last days. And I want to use as kind of the source material for this particular segment. There's all kinds of things that we could do, but I'd like to start from the reference point of the book of Enoch, because included in the book of Enoch are a series of prophecies that start from the beginning of the world and go up through the end of it. And I think that they are very insightful. Now, we're going to go through a prophecy that I refer to as the 10-week prophecy. And this prophecy begins in around, chapter 92, 93 of the book of Enoch. And, it is really fascinating. And the book of Enoch that I like to use is the R.H. Charles translation. I think that R.H. Charles did an incredible job. He based his translation technique off of a translation technique that was really spearheaded and pioneered by the Germans. When the Germans got their hands on Richard Lawrence's translation of the Book of Enoch that he performed by taking his Ethiopic text and just doing a translation as best as he could. Now, the Germans took every available Ethiopic text and compared it, just a next level translation. And R.H. Charles was pretty impressed with how the Germans did that. And so he actually, by the time he came around to do his, they had discovered more texts. And so he put together over 20 different copies of the Book of Enoch and came up with a very precise and accurate copy or translation of the Book of Enoch in English, probably the most accurate that we have. And it was a very scholarly book or very scholarly translation. So that's the one that I like to use myself. Now, in this prophecy, Enoch takes the history of the world from the beginning to the end and divides it up into 10 weeks. Now, these 10 weeks are based off of the biblical timeline. Now, the biblical timeline, you have about 4,000 years before the birth of Christ, and then you have another 3,000 years plus a little time and a season after what is known as the millennium occurs, wherein Lucifer is released from his prison planet, and then you have round 2 of the Battle of Armageddon after the millennial period, and then the work is finished. Now, most people believe that when we're talking about the history of the earth from a biblical perspective, that there are 7,000-year periods of time up until the end of the millennium. And then you have this little brief period of time that Satan is going to be free to wreak havoc once more. We don't know how long that little period of time is. So we know that we probably have 7,000 years plus a little stub period. Now, we need to be able to, because Enoch is breaking the history of the world up into 10 weeks, we need to be able to quantify this period of time. So I believe that the way that Enoch does this is he takes the history of the world up until he is taken up to be with God as week number 1. And then all of the time subsequent to that is broken up into equal periods of time, wherein you have 9 remaining weeks, and each week is comprised of 7 days, and each of those days is comprised of 100 years. So a week would be 700 years. The 9 remaining weeks would be 6,300 years. And because Enoch was taken up to walk with God according to the biblical timeline, 987 years after the fall, we can assume that the first 1,000 years of the Earth's recorded history is equivalent to the first week of Enoch's prophecy. So this is kind of the timing that I have interpreted Enoch's words to be. So with this in mind, let's jump into Enoch's prophecy and see what this tells us about where we are in this prophecy and what kinds of things we can expect to be happening in our day. And, obviously, if Enoch is going to be breaking up the history of the world into these different periods of time, the things that he's going to highlight from each of these periods of time are going to be very relevant to us. Because remember, in the opening verses of the book of Enoch, he says that he is not writing this book for any other group of people other than those that will be living in the last days, during the days of trial. So these are things that he's going to be pointing out in each of these 10 weeks that will be relevant to us when we are going through the raucous time period that leads up to when the earth is purged of its wickedness. So I am going to begin my reading in the book of Enoch, chapter 93, verse 2. Now, here Enoch begins his prophecy, and he says, "According to that which appeared to me in the heavenly vision, in which I have known through the word of the holy angels and have learned from the heavenly tablets." And Enoch began to recount from the books and said, "I was born the 7th in the first week, while judgment and righteousness still endured. And after me, there shall arise the 2nd week, great wickedness." Okay, so what we're talking about here is, Enoch is clearly putting himself as being born in the first week, and that after him, that's when the 2nd week starts. So this is where I came up with the first 1,000 years of this time period is kind of the starting point. And then it becomes symmetrical from this point forward. And he is saying, hey, after him, the world becomes really wicked. And this is, of course, why the world is going to be wiped out with the flood. So let's jump to chapter 93, verse 4. "And after me," meaning after his people, his righteous people, were lifted up and translated by the Lord, "there shall arise in the 2nd week great wickedness, and deceit shall have sprung up. And in it there shall be the first end. And in it a man shall be saved. And after it is ended, unrighteousness shall grow up, and a law shall be made for the sinners." Okay, what are we talking about? Here we are clearly talking about the first end being the earth would be destroyed to purge the wickedness of the watchers that had utterly corrupted the pre-diluvian world. And that this man that would be saved would be Enoch's great-grandson, who was Noah. And Noah, of course, would be a covenant and a righteous covenant-keeping man and would essentially be like the new Adam. And in Noah, Enoch's seed would be preserved because Enoch had made a covenant with the Lord, and just like Adam had made a covenant with the Lord, and Seth had made a covenant with the Lord, and Noah made a covenant with the Lord, and Abraham made a covenant with the Lord as well. Now, according to Enoch, once the world was destroyed, it said that a law shall be made for the sinners. Now, what is it referring to here? Well, the book of Enoch clearly talks about the period of time where all of the unrighteous people that lived before the flood were sent to Sheol, or a spiritual prison. And Peter talked about how the Son of God, after he was crucified, went and preached unto the spirits that were in prison as a result of the entire world being destroyed except for Noah and his family. I believe that this is referring to this law that shall be made for the sinners, meaning Christ would go and preach the gospel unto the dead, that they might have an opportunity to repent, because while they were in life, the corruption of the watchers was so pervasive that people just didn't have a chance. So it seems like this law that Enoch is talking about is mercy that is being extended to them by way of this opportunity that Christ would give them by going and preaching the gospel to them while they were in spirit prison. Now we move to Enoch 93, verse 5. And after that, in the third week, at its close, a man shall be elected as the plant of righteous judgment, and his posterity shall become the plant of righteousness forevermore. Now, this is clearly speaking of the rise of the house of Israel. Now, if we look at the biblical timeline, Abraham lived around 1750 BC, or on the sixth day of the third week. So this mirrors very well what Enoch had prophesied would happen when he said, after that, in the third week at its close, a man shall be elected as the plant of righteous judgment. So it seems that this interpretation that I have made, where you have the first 1,000-year period which corresponds with the time that Enoch was still on the earth, being the first week, and then the 9 remaining weeks being symmetrical in their accounting for the remaining history, where each day is 100 years. That lines up perfectly with what Enoch is saying. So so far we've got 3 takeaways. You have, in the first week, Enoch and his people were lifted up from the world. In the second week, you have the destruction of the world and a new law given to those that were destroyed, the wicked. And then in the third week, you have the rise of the new post-diluvian covenant in Abraham. And those are all highlighted because they are all very important, or should be very important to us. Now let's go to verse 6 in the 93rd chapter. And after that, in the fourth week, at its close, visions of the holy and righteous shall be seen, and a law for all generations, and an enclosure shall be made for them. Okay, what are we talking about? If we're talking about the fourth week, we're talking about the period of time from 1600 BC to 900 BC. Now, during this period of time, Moses received the 10 Commandments atop of Mount Sinai. He would have done this on the second day of that week, which would have been around 1500 BC. And on the last day of this week, King Solomon built his famous temple, which housed the Ark of the Covenant. So, again, this seems to align very well with this timing that Enoch is, putting out there. So again, the 10 Commandments are incredibly relevant to us today. And the Temple of Solomon is also very relevant to us today, because in the temple is where Israel would make and renew covenants with the God of Israel, and they would offer their sacrifices. It's where they would go to atone for their sins, or, remember the law of Moses was meant to be a schoolmaster pointing the Israelites to the coming sacrifice that would be made by the Son of God, and how the people would need to retain that sacrifice in remembrance. Because really, as Paul taught, there is no quantity of unblemished lambs that man can sacrifice that will legitimately atone for his sins. For this to take place, you need a perfect and just God that would be willingly sacrificed for mankind. And this is why I believe that Enoch is pointing these things out as things that would be very important and that would take place during the fourth week. Now we move on to the fifth week. And after that, in the fifth week, at its close, the house of glory and dominion shall be built forever. Now, this fifth week corresponds with the period of time from 900 BC to 200 BC. And Enoch says that the house of glory would be built forever. Now, this is really interesting because he's not referring to the Temple of Solomon here, because this Temple of Solomon was built in the fourth week, and it did not last forever. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and then it was rebuilt and destroyed again. So the temple that is being built during the fifth week at its close has to be something different. So what are we talking about? Well, what happened during this period of time, 900 BC to 200 BC? Well, you may recall that this is when the lost 10 tribes were removed. That happened when the king of Assyria came into the northern kingdom of Israel around 720 BC and wiped them out. Now, during the same period of time, Ezekiel has this very interesting vision wherein he sees a temple that exists during his day, but it's not located in Jerusalem. And I think that that temple that he is referring to is this temple that has been built by the lost 10 tribes. And elsewhere in Enoch's writings, he talks about the time when the Dome of the Rock is going to be lifted up and removed from Temple Mount, and that this other temple is going to descend out of heaven and rest upon the Temple Mount. I think that he is referring to this house of glory and dominion that was built sometime between 900 BC and 200 BC by the lost 10 tribes that will be restored on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in the last days through some absolutely incredible black swan event that no one is looking for. That this temple already exists and will remain forever. This is what I think this means. Now, just so that you have a better idea of what I'm talking about, I'm going to read you a little excerpt from another prophecy that talks about what I just mentioned. This comes from the book of Enoch, chapter 90, verse 29. And I saw till the Lord of sheep brought a new, greater, and loftier house than the first, meaning a temple that was greater and loftier than the Temple of Solomon, and set it in the place of the first, which had been folded up. All of its pillars were new, and its ornaments were new, and larger than those of the first, and the old one which he had taken away, and all the sheep were within it. So this is what I was talking about, how the structure that is existing upon the Temple Mount in Jerusalem will be lifted up and removed, and a new temple will descend out of heaven onto that Temple Mount. That's very, very interesting. And, again, this prophecy is from the book of Enoch and is very, very ancient. You may recall from an earlier episode that the book of Enoch was discovered amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls and was written in ancient Aramaic, which is a language that predates Hebrew. So this is old stuff. So very, very curious. Now we move on to Enoch's prophecy of the sixth week. This is our verse 8. And after that, in the sixth week, all who live in it shall be blinded, and the hearts of all of them shall godlessly forsake wisdom. And in it a man shall ascend, and at its close the house of dominion shall be burnt with fire, and the whole race of the chosen root shall be dispersed. Okay, this has to correspond with 200 BC to 500 AD. Now, clearly, we're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem when the Temple of Solomon was, or not Solomon, Temple of Herod was destroyed, and there was not a single block left on top of each other. And this man who ascended is obviously Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. And Enoch's reference that all men's eyes would be blinded and the hearts of them would forsake wisdom, is referring to the house of Judah and how Jesus Christ would be a stumbling block, that they would not recognize the God that they claimed to worship. And as a result, rather than worshiping him, they would crucify him. And because of that, their temple would be destroyed and the Jews would be scattered to the four winds. This is, important for us to understand for reasons that I have explained in prior episodes. So again, this seems to be lining up perfectly well. And, you look at this time period again, 200 BC to 500 AD, both the last two nation states of Israel, which I referred to in the prior episode, which would have been the Jews and the house of Joseph in America, were both destroyed during this period of time. Okay, now we go to verse 9 in the 93rd chapter of Enoch. And after that, in the 7th week, shall an apostate generation arise, and many shall be its deeds, and all its deeds shall be apostate. Now, this is very interesting because it's referring to the period of time from 500 AD to 1200 AD. And during this time, we refer to this period of time as the Dark Ages. The early Christian church by this time had fallen into apostasy. You had the Roman Catholic Church that had been usurped by the Nicolaitans during this period of time, as is spoken of very clearly in the first 4 chapters of the book of Revelation. And you have some of the grossest, abominations that are done in the name of God during this period of time. So this is what Enoch is talking about, this period where an apostate generation arises and all of its deeds are apostate. So you've got, people paying for forgiveness of sins. You've got the blatant persecution of many people by the Catholic Church, including the Jews. You just have, it's called the Dark Ages for a very good reason. And this is important for us to understand that, much of the plain and precious teachings of the gospel were lost in apostasy during this period of time. This is, actually when you start having crazy things happen where we reintroduce the worshiping of the Queen of Heaven during this period of time. The Catholic Church begins praying to the Queen of Heaven and all kinds of other, crazy things. Now we move on. All right, we're going to continue talking about this same period of time in verses 10 through 14. Enoch gives some more information about this period of time that he wants us to understand. So picking up in verse 10. And at its close, meaning the close of the 7th week, so you're getting towards the end of that week, which corresponds with 1200 AD, shall be elected the elect righteous of the eternal plant of righteousness, to receive sevenfold instruction concerning all his creation. For who is there of all the children of men that is able to hear the voice of the Holy One without being troubled? And who can think his thoughts? And who is there that can behold all the works of heaven? And how should there be one who could behold all of heaven? And who is there that could understand the things of heaven, and see a soul or a spirit, and could tell thereof, or ascend and see all their ends, and think them or do like them? And who is there of all men that could know what is in the breadth or the length of the earth, and to whom has been shown the measure of all of them? Or is there anyone who could discern the length of the heaven, and how great is its height, and upon what it was founded, and how great is the number of the stars, and where all the luminaries rest? Okay. Enoch stated that some amazing things would occur at the close of the 7th week, which of course corresponds with around 1200 AD. Now, to understand this a little bit better, we need to think about the revelation contained in John the Divine's writings, particularly regarding this book with 7 seals. Because in the book that has 7 seals, this is basically taking the history of the world and dividing it into 7 equal periods. So you've got, with the 7th period being the millennium. The book with 7 seals doesn't seem to talk about this period of time where Satan is released from his prison planet to go about and tempt everybody one last time. But when you look at the 6th seal, that would correspond with this period of time. And so there's some interesting things that we should look at there in order to be able to understand what the heck Enoch is talking about, because Enoch seems to be inferring that during this period of time, around 1200 AD, which falls within the 6th seal of the book of Revelation, you would have a group of people that would be righteous and that they would receive sevenfold instruction concerning all of God's creations. And Enoch goes on and talks about how these creations are so vast that no one can know the height and the breadth of heaven or the number of the stars unless they were instructed by God. Now, Enoch seems to be suggesting that this did, in fact, happen. Well, in the book of Revelation, you have some very curious things that are spoken of during this period of time. So let's look and see what the book of Revelation talks about so that we can, maybe get a little more insight into what it is that Enoch is trying to communicate here. So to understand this, again, we got to go and look at this book with 7 seals in it, with each of these seals corresponding to a 1,000-year period of the Earth's history. So the 6th seal talks about 144,000 righteous young virgins that come forth from all prior dispensations of the Earth's history. And they are resurrected. And John says that they receive special wisdom. They know songs that only they can sing, and they stand night and day in the presence of Jesus Christ. So I believe that when Enoch is saying that he saw during this 7th seal or this 7th week that there were elect and righteous ones from the eternal plant of righteousness, which corresponds with Abraham and his covenant, meaning the house of Israel. And John sees during this same period of time 144,000 righteous young men that are called from 12,000 each from one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they are resurrected and taught special things and given a special mission. I think we're talking about the same thing here. Now, apparently, according to Enoch, some of the special information that these 144,000 received pertains to all the creations that the Lord has made and not just earth. So that is really interesting. So now we're going to turn to the 8th week of Enoch's vision, which will correspond with the period of time from 1200 AD to 1900 AD. So consider the following. This comes from verse 15 of Book of Enoch, chapter 93. And after that, there shall be another, the 8th week, that of righteousness. And a sword shall be given to it, that a righteous judgment may be executed on the oppressors, and the sinners shall be delivered into the hands of the righteous. And at its close they shall acquire houses through their righteousness. And a house shall be built for the great king in glory forevermore. And all mankind shall look to the path of uprightness. Now, according to the prophecy above, during the 8th week, righteousness would be restored to the earth, and another temple would be built for the great king. Now, this temple would hold the keys to the covenants of God, so that all mankind who wish to obtain that covenant would have to enter into that house to do so. You have Isaiah talking about this same period of time in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. And he says, "And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the tops of the mountains, and shall be exalted above all the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up into the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." Okay, now, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have a very unique perspective on this. We believe that during this period, during 1200 AD to 1900 AD, you had the beginning of the Reformation, which this is when you have people starting to look at the corruption that had entered into the Catholic Church and said, listen, guys, this is bonkers. This is, the church is teaching all these extra biblical practices. We're not going to do this anymore. And you actually had other churches that started to rise. This began amongst the Germans, who were actually the first to have a Bible. The Germans had a Bible before the Latin Vulgate was ever even available. The first Bible to ever have been compiled was put together by a man known as Wulfilia, who was of both Greek and Germanic descent, and he went and preached the gospel to the Germanic tribes, which is why you had the rise of the Arian controversy, wherein the Germanic tribes believed that God the Father and Jesus Christ were separate individuals, and this is why there was so much friction in the early church when you had the Arian controversy compared to, the Council of Nicaea, which claimed that Jesus Christ, his Father, and the Holy Ghost were actually one mysterious conglomeration of a single entity. Now, the Germans, you have Martin Luther and his thesis, 93 things that he says the Catholic Church are doing wrong. You also have the creation of the Germans republish other versions of the Bible during this period of time. And then the Catholic Church completely loses grip when a German man invents the printing press. That's Gutenberg. And then you have Bibles all over the place. And that really got the common man starting to think. And from the perspective of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, of course, you have the foundation of the United States of America. And then in 1820, you have the boy Joseph Smith, who goes into the woods behind his house and prays unto the Lord to know what church he should join. And the Lord tells him, listen, all of the churches they've lost the truth. There is no church with all of the truth. It's going to need to be restored. And Joseph Smith was called to be a prophet to restore that. And the church was officially restored on April 6th, 1830. This is, of course, what all members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believe. And then very shortly after the restoration of the church, Joseph Smith received revelations that the saints needed to build temples, and that in those temples we would create or have a place where we could make sacred covenants with the Lord, just like the house of Israel did in ancient times. So when I'm, as a Latter-day Saint, when I'm reading this verse from Enoch, and I'm going to read it again, I'm thinking of the restoration of the church. I'm thinking of the fact that temples are being built once more upon the earth, and that all of this begins during this 8th week. So listen to this with this context in mind. And after that, there shall be another, the 8th week, that of righteousness. And a sword shall be given to it, that a righteous judgment may be executed on the oppressors, and sinners shall be delivered into the hands of the righteous. And at its close they shall acquire houses through their righteousness, and a house shall be built for the great King in glory forevermore, and all mankind shall look to the path of uprightness. Then, of course, I read that passage in Isaiah about how he prophesied that in the last days the Lord's house would be built in the top of the mountains. Now, the quintessential temple for the Church of Jesus Christ is the temple in Salt Lake City, Utah. And Utah is a Ute Indian word that means the tops of the mountains. Now, most LDS people will believe that the construction of the Salt Lake Temple was a literal fulfillment of this passage in Isaiah and is what Enoch is talking about in chapter 93, verse 15. And as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I believe that that is what that means. So now moving on to the 16th verse in the same chapter. And after that, in the 9th week, the righteous judgment shall be revealed to the whole world, and all the works of the godless shall vanish from all the earth, and the world shall be written down for destruction. Okay, so at the end of the 8th week, Enoch saw that there would be a sword given to the righteous and that there would be a judgment on the oppressors. In the 9th week, all of the wicked would vanish away from the earth. So what are we talking about? We're talking about how in the 8th week, you would have world wars, but that the righteous would prevail over evil. And then in the 9th week, you would have all of the wicked. They would be extinct. The world would be purged from all wickedness during this period of time. So you're talking the 9th week is comprising the periods from 1900 AD to 2600 AD. And during this period of time, obviously you have what is known as the great and dreadful day of the Lord and the ushering in of the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. Now, the book of Enoch is all about the fact that the wicked will be wiped off of the earth in the last days, just like they were wiped off the earth during the days of Noah. I believe that this is what Enoch is talking about here. So then we go to the 10th week. This is spoken of in verse 17. And after this, in the 10th week, in the 7th part, meaning the last day, there shall be the great eternal judgment, in which he will execute vengeance amongst the angels, meaning vengeance upon the hosts of heaven. According to Enoch, in the last 100 years of the 10th week, God the Father is going to unleash his final and great eternal judgment upon all creation. This judgment will not be executed by the angels, but on the angels, meaning Satan and the 1/3 of the hosts of heaven that followed him. This means this is the great end where the work is finished and Satan is dealt with permanently. And this is how Enoch concludes this with verses 18 and 19. And the first heaven shall depart away, and a new heaven shall appear. And all the powers of heavens shall be given sevenfold light. And after that there shall be many weeks without number forever. And all shall be in goodness and righteousness, and sin shall no more be mentioned forever. So again, this is referring to the fact that once Satan is finally dealt with, the Father's great plan of salvation will be concluded, and the righteous will enter into their reward, and Satan will be cast off into outer darkness, and we will never have to worry about him ever again. So this is a really interesting prophecy from Enoch, I think, and it as I'm going through these things, and I'm thinking of all the different signs of the times that we've been given in lots of different scriptures in the Old and New Testament, I think that these things marry up very well with what we've read about in the book of Enoch. Now, let's just review some of these things, because I know that there's a lot of people that, think that, the second coming is a long, long, long time away. And one of the reasons that they think this is because you take most of those signs of the times and you can see them in every generation that the world has been around, because there have always been wars and rumors of wars. There's always been earthquakes in diverse places. There's always been fires all over the place and waves heaving beyond their bounds. So this is why all of these different generations that have lived on the earth have always thought that Christ was about to come. But in light of the book, or this prophecy that Enoch gave us, there were some very specific things in timing that had to take place, which lines up not with every generation that has been, but with our generation specifically. Now, what are some other things that we can take away from the book of Enoch that help to kind of highlight the fact that, hey, we're getting pretty close? Well, I think that one of the real interesting things, and we've talked about this before, but I think it's very important to bring it up now, is that within the book of Enoch, we learn about these 200 watchers that corrupted the pre-diluvian world. And Enoch tells us that in the end times, the watchers will return, and that the Lord bound them for 70 generations. And I've mentioned that if you interpret a generation to be the lifespan of mankind, well, the Lord changed the lifespan of mankind after the flood. Prior to the flood, men lived for hundreds of years. After the flood, the Lord dramatically decreased the lifespan of man. And in fact, if you look at the lifespan of a human being prior to the advent of modern medicine, assuming that you survived childbirth and early childhood, you could expect to live about, into your early 60s. Now, in fact, the average lifespan is about, 63 years prior to the advent of modern medicine. Well, curiously enough, if you take the amount of time between the Great Flood, according to what most Bible scholars calculate that to be, and now, and divide that by 70 generations, you get about 63 years as well. Meaning, according to the book of Enoch, 70 generations have passed. And as a result, we should be expecting that we are going to see the return of the watchers any day now. And curiously enough, we now have all of these strange signs and wonders going on in the skies, and Congress is talking about, UFOs all over the place. Friends, I do not believe that this is coincidental. And we have not had this kind of activity to this degree, as far as I know, in any other time since the Great Flood. Yes, we have had some one-off kind of things, like was described in the Thule papyrus and at the destruction of Jerusalem, according to Flavius Josephus, when he said that there were all kinds of crazy things seen in the sky. Actually, NASA put out a very interesting paper on UFOs in antiquity, where you have some crazy depictions by the Romans and other ancient civilizations of craft coming down and landing in the middle of battlefield, and people getting out and walking around that looked just like humans, and they presumed that they were the gods. I mean, you had some things like this happening, but they were one-off. Whereas today, according to ever increasing numbers of testimonies of people coming before Congress, this is happening at an exponentially increasing rate. In fact, we are seeing things like this above our most secure airspace on a daily basis. So this alone is telling me, hey, something's about to happen. And also, when you go and you look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, this is where Paul is writing a letter to the saints and saying, listen, guys, don't get confused. Christ is not going to come until you have the Antichrist until that son of perdition is revealed, and he comes with all the deceivableness and all the power of Satan, meaning this man isn't Satan, but he is empowered by Satan. This is the Antichrist. So that Paul gave that as being the telltale sign that the second coming is imminent, when you see that man arise. And we have not yet seen the rise of this man. But curiously enough, in the prior episodes, if you will recall, we have some very interesting accounts of people that are suggesting that this buildup of all of these things that we're seeing in the skies, there is a purpose to it. And it's culminating, according to Chris Bledsoe, in the ushering in of a new age of the divine feminine, which, according to Chris Bledsoe, let's hope that, he is being deceived about this, but according to him, the world will usher into this new stage in April of 2026, which, friends, is not very long away. So you also have other people that are coming out of some of these congressional hearings, and they are saying, hey, there are these whistleblowers that are talking about this crazy, staged event that's going to take place around the year 2027. So that is also very curious. Again, this isn't me saying this stuff. These are whistleblowers that are saying these things under oath to members of Congress. So that is really interesting. And then, of course, one of the real big signs of the times is going to be the rise and fall of the Whore of Babylon. And anyone who is looking at the world today knows that the Whore of Babylon is alive and kicking. The Whore of Babylon is seeking to obtain dominion over all nations, tongues, and peoples. And we most definitely have people that are working in the background to implement some strange, form of world government wherein, the freedoms of, mankind are limited and dictated by a bizarre group of elitists that know best. They know what we should be doing better than we do, apparently. And according to the book of Revelation and also other scriptures, when you see the fall of that organization, that is the telltale sign that Christ is about ready to come back. And of course, you read in the book of Revelation about this nation state or this conglomeration of nations that's represented by this dragon head that received this deadly head wound and had 10 horns, and that this entity is the entity that brings down the Whore of Babylon. They hate the whore and they destroy the whore, and they do so in 1 hour. And in the prior episode, where I went into a lot of detail about that and talked about how, hey, this may line up with the BRICS nations, and this nation state that received a deadly head wound but was healed could correspond with communism or socialism. I mean, you have Russia fell and has risen to position of great power and authority in the world, again having been the mastermind between the rise of the BRICS plus nations. And at this time, when I talked about that episode, I mentioned the fact that I was concerned that the BRICS nations might use precious metals as a means of bringing to pass the collapse of the Whore of Babylon. And I talked about how, incredibly leveraged the Western banking system has become with precious metals and derivatives. And, since, that episode came out, I think my episode on the Whore of Babylon was, published on October 24th. When you look at what the price of silver was, I think it was $48. Silver today is $58, almost $59 $56. It almost hit $60. I mean, you're talking about a $12 increase in what, a little over a month's time? I don't know when something like this has happened under such bizarre circumstances. And I mean, you have the day after Thanksgiving. I don't know if any of you were following this or not, but the COMEX shut down. And it was really just silver trading shut down. They claimed that it was because the air conditioners for their data centers had broken, and the data centers being located in Chicago. Now, that's very peculiar because, most data centers don't just rely on one cooling system. They have backups and backups to those backups. And, even if the cooling system did in reality go down, why were all commodities other than silver able to be exchanged business as usual? Well, it turns out that word on the street is that there were some massive calls for physical delivery that were taking place, and there simply was not the silver to be able to provide delivery. And so they halted trading while they tried to negotiate in lieu of silver settlements. And my understanding is that there were about $65 million in premiums paid out to folks that had demanded physical silver. They were paid these premiums so that they would accept cash settlements instead of taking delivery because there was no silver. And then at this exact same time, you had JP Morgan Chase, which is by far the world's largest trader in silver, shift their entire trading desk over to Asia. That is very interesting. I mean, to me, that is an acknowledgement that the control over these things has now shifted to the East and that the West is no longer in the driver's seat. And my understanding is that all of these contracts that were supposed to receive physical delivery in December, they got postponed until March. And so rather than resolving this issue, the can has just been kicked down the road. Now, this we may find that this turns out just to be a bunch of rumors and this, that, and the other, but you overlay this with the fact that this all occurred during a period of time when within 48 hours silver ran up $6. That is insane. I mean, those kinds of run-ups in silver just don't happen. Something has to be breaking down behind the scenes for silver to experience these kinds of 20% moves in a very short period of time. So, yeah, to me, this may be a sign of the time as well that, hey, there is some fragility in the system going on right now, and we may see a major collapse coming up. I mean, and it's not like silver is the only thing that the Whore of Babylon is dealing with. You have, so many complex instruments that, frankly, most people, haven't the foggiest clue of how to even describe what a derivative instrument is. And, there are trillions of dollars of derivative instruments in circulation. And, by their nature, derivatives are highly leveraged instruments. And, all it takes is a black swan style event to cause things that are so complex as derivatives to come crashing down. And, silver is one leg of this, stool that I believe is about to come crashing down. And, you have billions and billions and billions of dollars, wrapped up into silver derivatives. But, frankly, there are other things that most people, have no clue about that, could also end up being black swan events. And, particularly, I am thinking of the economy in Japan. Most people don't realize this, but Japan has been staving off financial disaster by lending Japanese yen for basically nothing to the world. I mean, the interest rate on loans from the Bank of Japan in yen since 2016 through 2024 has fluctuated between 0%, well, actually negative 0.1% to positive 0.25%. I mean, for most of that time, it was actually zero. So you could basically borrow Japanese yen for free, and you would have these, large institutions like banks could actually, for every dollar that they had, they could borrow $500 in Japanese yen, essentially for free. And this is one of the reasons that you have such an epic increase in every asset class known to man, because you have so many large financial institutions essentially getting free money and then turning around and investing that money into every asset class known to man, and doing so at incredibly leveraged 500 to 1 in most instances, or in many instances. And that works out fine and dandy as long as the Bank of Japan does not raise interest rates. But surprise, surprise, in 2025, the Bank of Japan raised interest rates for the first time in many, many years. And because they raised interest rates, that sparked a bit of panic, because imagine that you have leveraged your borrowing 500 to 1, and you were doing so at a very small interest rate, next to nothing, and then all of a sudden it jumps up to 0.25%. Now, that may not sound like much, but it's 0.25% on 500 times. So that was a big, black swan event. And then I'm concerned about December, because the Bank of Japan is, Japan, they're struggling with inflation right now. And so they're under pressure to raise interest rates again. And at the same time, you have the Fed, who is planning on cutting interest rates in the United States. So you have all of these financial institutions that are leveraged to their eyeballs, and now you have potentially a double whammy in the United States cutting interest rates, and the Bank of Japan raising interest rates. So these guys are going to have to start liquidating assets because the money that they're borrowing is now jumping up again. And there are some people that have speculated that the activity that's going on in Japan is actually one of the big reasons that you have seen a sell-off in cryptocurrency. I don't know if you've been following cryptocurrency, but you had this massive kind of out of the blue drop in crypto that in my mind corresponds very tightly with the Bank of Japan coming out and saying, hey, you know what, I think we're going to have to raise interest rates again. And so people with all this, free money are now panicking that they have to get their loans paid back before the interest rates go up, because they're leveraged to their eyeballs. So they sell all of the liquid assets that they can. And, those liquid assets are things like Bitcoin and, stocks. I think that you could see some unintended consequences coming out of things like this. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but it is something that I am watching very closely. If Japan raises their interest rate, that will weaken the US dollar. And if the Fed lowers our interest rate, that will further weaken the US dollar. And you know what happens when the US dollar falls? Precious metals go up like a rocket. So I think you could see, even though we have seen silver do a big run up, if you see towards the end of December, both the Bank of Japan and the Fed cut interest rates, man, I don't know. You're going to see some significant pressure being exerted upon the Western bullion banks. And again, the Western bullion banks, they are leveraged about 300 to 1. And this could unravel very, very quickly. And of course, you have the BRICS nations that are stockpiling physical metal in ways that we've never seen nation states stockpile before. I mean, no nation state has ever stockpiled physical silver. But, since I first started talking about this, the United States has come out and said, okay, listen, we are going to list silver as a critical mineral, which means we're going to start stockpiling it. And China has come out and said that they are putting export controls on silver. That is very concerning because 90% of refined silver comes out of China. So this is curious. I think that the United States, last time I looked, I believe we do not have a whole lot of silver refinery capacity here in the United States to be able to take silver out to a 99.9% purity. I mean, we may have one or two refiners in the country that can do that. So yeah, we're headed into some exciting times. So keep your eyes on the prize, my friends. There is a lot going on. I think that, we need to be aware. And remember, Christ said that these things were going to sneak up on us, as a thief in the night. There are many people, out there that, are saying, hey, all is well. The economy is strong. Everything is awesome. We're about to enter into a new golden age. Well, there are a lot of things that when I look out there, I am concerned about. And I see how these things potentially line up with some of these, prophecies that are thousands and thousands of years old. And, I think that we just need to be wise. No one was ever sorry for preparing themselves and then, not, being taken out. But there are many people that weep and wail and gnash their teeth when things start happening for which they are not prepared. So, hopefully, as you're listening to the episodes, of this podcast, so far, you're thinking about what's going on in the world around you, and you begin to ask yourself, hey, am I taking these things seriously enough? God hasn't given us, the feeling of fear. He doesn't want us to be consumed by fear. He wants us to have hope in the future. But at the same time, we need to be wise and we need to prepare. And so in the next episode, I would like to talk about, some of the things that I think that we can do to better prepare ourselves for what is coming. And hint, 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 I think that the best things that you can do to prepare are going to be spiritual in nature. All right, friends, I think that about wraps it up for us in this episode. I hope that this has been useful for you. And in the interim, I want you to be engaging in your own spiritual education. I want you to seek to be taught by the Lord. It's awesome that you're listening to this podcast and other podcasts, but friends, far and away, the most important voice that you should be listening to is that of the Holy Ghost. And the Lord sends the Holy Ghost to all those that seek for it. For they that seek shall find. Until next time, friends, God bless.
You have just finished an episode of the Black Swan Rising podcast, an L10 production, hosted by Michael B. Rush. For show notes, transcriptions, and extras, please visit www.theblackswanrisingpodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, click the share button icon and send it to your friends and family. This will help to ensure the continued publication of future content. Michael thanks you in advance for sharing and looks forward to seeing you next time. Until then, keep seeking, for they that seek shall find.